It's great. It's great to have this. What a great overflow crowd, but not a surprise. It's my pleasure to introduce this keynote session on globalization. What's next? To my left is a pretty esteemed crowd. I'm not sure what I'm doing here actually with this kind of crowd, but I'm delighted to introduce Bruce Greenwald, who is the Robert Heilbrunn Professor of Asset Management and Finance and co-director of the Heilbrunn Center for Graham and Dodd Investing. And to his left, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, who really needs no introduction, but is technically executive director and co-founder of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue and University Professor of Finance and Economics. And the dean, who is famous, Dean Glenn Hubbard, the Russell Carson Professor of Finance and Economics, but who is our leader and theme director, and who we're in awe of pretty much. So, Dean, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So anyway, in 2 minutes. I'm not exact. Again, I mean that. I'm not. This is a crowd that is far beyond my standing in life. But my background for 1 minute. I spent 20 years at Goldman Sachs. I was a partner running the private debt trading business, bank loans, distressed investing, et cetera. And now I am managing partner at CBC, which is the largest private equity firm in Europe. And I run their credit investing business as the CIO and managing partner. And as I was thinking about why the dean may have asked me to do this, I was just looking at the agenda and thinking, I'm not exactly sure what I'm doing with this theme, except that I started to think about what my business really involves. And hopefully it will stimulate you all to think about your own business and this topic. Really, the business I'm in alternative credit investing, involves two pretty simple things. You go around the world globally and meet with investors who are pretty sophisticated pension funds and sovereign wealth funds and trying to convince them to give you money to invest for them. And then you turn around and look at the global markets and try and figure out, in my case, in debt, in distressed and stressed investments, where globally to deploy that capital and earn the targeted rate of return that you promise these super sophisticated institutional investors. The one word that comes up in my life, almost beyond what I ever thought I would be doing, is this word of global, the concept of globalization. What does it mean? How do you connect with your clients globally and be meaningful to them? And how do you source investments and evaluate management teams and find value investments, okay, in my particular case in the debt area. So all I can say is prior to being at Columbia, I was nowhere on these topics. I mean, literally nowhere. Vague understanding of economics and from an undergraduate degree, but that was about it. The network that I developed here, the connections, the appreciation, the constant theme around you have to connect globally and you have to alter your mindset from, in my case, the Midwest, New York City, and the United States, and you have to get out there and think about not only what you're going to do for them, but also how they can add to your own firm's business is what I spend all my time thinking about. So I'm going to be in the front row listening to every word. And with that, thank you, Dean, for having me, and I'll turn it over to the Dean.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, I sometimes have to ask sophisticated people for money, and I don't even give any back. So I appreciate how hard that must be. This is a panel that probably some years ago you would have asked why we were bothering, because the trends for globalization in the world are so inevitable for all the reasons that Steve said. But of course, globalization, it's not just today. if you asked me to think about peaks, 1913 would have been a peak year of globalization. It wasn't for decades after 1913 that the world was as integrated as it was then. So this is not something that you should take for granted as manna from heaven. We have two people here to talk with today who are special in so many ways, both of whom I've known for decades. Bruce for many years, going back to Harvard days. I think of Joe as my teacher. He wasn't literally, but I grew up in an era where Atkinson and Stiglitz was the Bible for young geeks like myself. So despite some political differences, I still learn my economics from Joe. Another thing that I'll come back to later in our discussion, these two guys aren't just very smart people on an important subject. They actually teach on this in the MBA program, and I'm going to ask them to circle back to that as we go. But let me start with the elephant in the room. Tomorrow, something interesting or not is going to happen in France. The United States had an election in November. I think that surprised many people. I'll tell you a little story. Ray Horton, who some of you may know is a faculty colleague here, he and I did an event for students just before the election. And I told the students I thought there was a decent chance that Donald Trump could win. And I said that for two reasons. One, were just undercurrents in the electorate. And the second, the fact that my brother is a very successful country western singer. And he travels to all of the parts of the country I never see. And his view of what America wanted was so different from what I saw, it was jarring to me. And I think we now have Brexit. We now have the Trump election. We now have potentially Frexit. So I want to start with a big discussion for you two about globalization and discontent, to borrow from one of the two of you. What are the big structural issues you think led to the rise of this populism? Maybe you think of Trump as the apotheosis, but the populism we're seeing generally about globalization. Bruce or Joe?
You want me to start, Joe? Or?
Either way.
Okay, I'll go first.
They're not usually this polite.
Because I'm going to say all the right words to talk about globalization. It is not about globalization. What is going on is much more fundamental than that. It's been going on now for between 25 and almost, in the United States, 30 years. And globalization at various stages has exacerbated it, but has not, in fact, been the decisive factor. What's going on is that a hugely important, and important not only economically but emotionally, segment of the global economy, but also all the local economies, is dying. And the transition out of manufacturing, which is going away, and it is nobody's fault. It is not globalization. It is the fact that productivity growth in manufacturing is 5 to 7% a year properly measured, and global demand is maybe 2 to 3%, and that's been going on for a long time. That is created a situation where economically now services are completely dominant. And the demands of a service economy are very different from the demands of a traditional manufacturing economy. It's much better for women than for men. It's much better for educated people who are good at human relationships than people who have physical skills. It's actually much more unequal because people typically work in services on a much more individual basis than collective manufacturing processes, and it's been incredibly difficult for people to adapt to. Now, the reason I say globalization doesn't matter is services are locally produced and consumed. So that what you're seeing, and I'm going to talk sort of broadly, is that what happens in the United States is increasingly determined by what happens in the United States.
Somebody's a microphone. Yeah.
Oh, okay. What happens normally, by the way, I teach in this room and I don't need a microphone. So I'm getting old. Forgive me. That what services means is that because they're locally produced and consumed, countries individually make their own fates. And what that means in turn is that there's much less patience because there's much less benefit from outside interference. And That has happened both in the composition of businesses and in the nature of businesses. And what I want to talk about to bring this home is one business that has successfully made this transition that people are probably not particularly aware of. And the company I want to talk about, because I think it'll illustrate what's going on, is John Deere. John Deere was for years a global manufacturer. What's happened to John Deere's product line is that the cost of making the tractors, the seeders, the harvesters has shrunk steadily over time, and they last longer. So that cost has become a decreasingly important part of what they do. But the package that they offer consists of service support. You still have to have those tractors work all the time. It's crucial they get fixed rapidly. Increasingly, there's nobody in those machines, that in fact nobody does deep plowing anymore, that seeds are individually put into the ground, and there is local software that governs that process because it is customized to local soil conditions and to local weather. That because the machines last longer, there's a big second-hand market, which is a local market because you don't sort of export and import the used machines. And financing is still important, and financing is based at that level overwhelmingly on local knowledge of the credit reliability of your customers. That means that if you are in a region where 90% of the tractors are Deere, or the machinery is Deere machinery, you're going to go with Deere because they have the local economies of scale and the local infrastructure and the local knowledge, and there's almost nothing that Kubota and AGCO and the others can do to break into that market. What's made Deere so successful in the face of a complete collapse by historical standards in their demand and has sustained their profits is the fact that they have now a global strategy that consists of a very disciplined series of local initiatives. They dominate individual local markets one at a time. What that has meant, among other things, is that these local monopolies are much more profitable than traditional, globally competitive manufacturing markets. So on top of everything else, that firms and capital are also doing much better than workers in this environment because you've increasingly got these local markets that are dominatable. And that is an enormous change. And it is a change that has overwhelmed everything else that you've read about and is going to overwhelm Donald Trump along with it.
Before Joe turns to that, let me ask you on manufacturing. So why is it that countries keep the obsession with manufacturing? Describe what you see in terms of capacity issues in manufacturing, why this is a problem.
Well, maybe, a lot of countries are obsessed about agriculture. Agriculture is 2 or 3%. Countries look towards the past. Why you have Europe, the only common thing that they could agree on is subsidizing agriculture, even though it's 2 or 3% of their economy. You can say that there's a kind of nostalgia for it. I don't know why people want to be coal miners or why you would want to create a lot of jobs for coal miners, but, which pollute and have all other kinds of problems. But that's what he's focusing on. The numbers, Bruce always talks about the numbers of coal miners versus people in sports, professional sports.
Okay. So
but just to,
I'm ready to talk about it if you invite me, but I advise you not to.
But the other thing, the loss of retail jobs as shopping malls have closed down is bigger than the loss in coal mining. It is peculiar how certain things start to resonate and other things don't. So it's a political question of why certain things resonate, but not from an economic point of view. It doesn't make a lot of sense.
And what's your take on the structural issues?
There's one more comment, which is sometimes people look at Germany and they say, look, Germany has succeeded in keeping manufacturing. And the answer is, in a global economy, you may be able to carve out a little niche. It's a smaller economy than the United States. They invested a lot in apprenticeship and other, the structure of their industry. They were able to keep that. We might have 25 years ago, 30 years ago, been able to do it, but would have required big changes in the way we ran our education system and our manufacturing. But even Germany is likely to find it increasingly difficult as China moves up its production scale. Germany was lucky in producing machine goods, and that's, you might say, the last stage. Countries like Spain that were producing apparel were hit first, and as China moves up the learning scale, I think Germany is going to find it difficult remaining competitive on machine goods.
But on the structural issues, do you share Bruce's view that this is really a story about technological change and productivity growth in manufacturing as opposed to factors related to globalization itself?
I think what Bruce said was that globalization may have exacerbated. So there are two thought experiments that you might do. Would we have a problem if we had not had any globalization? That is to say, we were an isolated country. The answer is yes. But there's another thought experiment, which is if we had had no technological change and we had the degree of global integration and the way it's been managed that we had, would we have a problem? I think the answer is yes. So each of them alone is a strong enough force that it would have created a problem.
Did you have something you wanted to add?
Oh, yeah. Let me start. You can actually calculate which it is that is causing the trouble. And it is extraordinary to me that nobody bothers to do these numbers. And I'm going to go back to Ross Perot because we are, after all, many years out of school. And that was when we started talking about the giant sucking sound of jobs going to Mexico. If you look at the period from 1980 to 1991, and Perot ran in 92, U.S. demand for manufacturers rises by 32% in real terms. U.S. production of manufacturers rises by 26%. U.S. employment in manufacturers falls by 8%. The difference between plus 32 and minus 8 is 40 percentage points. The fraction of that that's due to imports and globalization is the difference between 26 and 32, which is 6%. That is 15% of the problem. Even today, with everything going on in China, 70% of the problem is technology, and about 30% of the problem is globalization. But, and here's where I think I would defer on importance of this issue to Glenn, jobs don't just have economic importance. There are jobs that historically have always had huge sociological and political importance. People did not believe that you could run a society successfully without yeoman farmers. So that when agriculture started to disappear for exactly the reasons that manufacturing is disappearing today, there are enormous efforts to save agriculture. And that's the sort of problem that you see vestigially today. And you see it has, by the way, no effect. Agriculture is basically gone. But people want to make things. They have an image of a worker as a guy in shirt sleeves working away
like
and sweating hard. Yeah, exactly. And producing
always been
goods
sartorially different.
by a wide margin. And what they've tried to do, therefore, is to preserve those jobs, and you can't do it on domestic demand. Okay. You have to do it by exporting. And that means that we have a chronic problem with international imbalances because the Japanese are trying to export the Germans are trying to export, the Chinese are trying to export, and you add up overall countries, the exports and the imports have to net out. So somebody's got to eat those exports. And you cannot export your way out of the problem. And in trying to do so, you create enormous pressure in the international system, both as countries like Japan and China try and game it, but also as the flows backwards, the financial flows that offset these chronic trade imbalances, put a lot of money in the hands of, and I hate to contradict our introducer, stupid foreign money that buys things like U.S. mortgages.
Management doesn't necessarily endorse all of the panel's views.
Go ahead. Sorry, Joe.
Okay, but Joe, you had something to interject.
Yeah. A part of the problem is the growth of inequality, and one of long-standing results in economics is that globalization, global integration between a developed country and a less developed country lowers the wages of the unskilled workers in the developed country. And so if to the extent that you're worried about inequality, not just jobs and not just particular kinds of jobs, manufacturing jobs, but you're worried about the wages of unskilled workers, which are, basically the same now or have gone lower than they were 30, 40 years ago, adjusted for inflation, that is affected by globalization. And that's the sense in which I think that globalization is part of the problem.
Yeah, can I give you the numbers on that one? Because Joe actually gave me a chance to do this. The total number in the U.S. economy of not just miners, but non-professional, which is non-degreed extractive workers, is about 130,000. The total number of professional athletes in the U.S. is about 240,000. That should tell you a lot about the nature of work in the U.S. economy. But think next about the distribution of both performance and wages among coal miners versus that distribution among professional athletes. That today the job market is dominated by service jobs. And the inequality shows up as or more importantly in those service sectors where, like the professional athletes, you see individual performance. Because they don't work in big factories where you get a joint product where it's hard to identify who's doing what. They work on a Goldman Sachs trading floor where you can see what goes on. And historically, we've seen professions like that, law and so on, and they are very unequal. So again, I would be careful about what you ascribe to globalization here and what you ascribe to the changing nature of the economy, which is ultimately driven by technology and is not going to change.
But it is still the case that when you have a global integration, as we have, think about the experiment of what would happen if we had full global integration. We're not there, but if you had full global integration, it's very clear that, and markets worked as perfectly as sometimes we pretend, which they don't, then unskilled workers everywhere in the world would get the same wage. And the implications of that are very profound. It would mean unskilled workers in the United States and unskilled workers in China would get the same wage. So we're not anywhere near that, but that's a strong force, lowering wages at the bottom, and that is part of, the unhappiness that you see both in Europe and America.
But Joe, that assumes there is this thing called unskilled workers, all of whom are the same. And that may be true in economic models, but in reality there are vast ranges of ability among those workers, and that's going to show up in
Before we get into a professorial smackdown, let me try to before, and I want to segue to talking about what we might do about things in policy, but I want to frame something. I heard you all mention jobs. I heard you all mention compression or depression in some areas of wages. But I want to put a face on this. We all three know Angus Deaton and Ann Case in their work. And we know that is what is happening to many low-income people in America, particularly low-skilled men, is not simply a collapse in income, but a collapse in other things. And I want to get your take on that before we turn to policy.
So what Glenn is referring to is this very important study that they began first a year ago, and then they updated last December, which showed that mortality, life expectancy among white males in each age category for those who were not college graduates was plummeting. And if you look at the rest of the world, life expectancy is going up. And when the most dramatic, I guess, number actually didn't come from the Case-Deaton study. It was actually the number that came out for the United States as a whole. And the average life expectancy of the United States is in decline. And that's really unusual to have these kinds of statistics. And then you looked at what was the source of it. And it wasn't like there was a disease going around, a virus, the Zika virus or something else. It was social diseases, suicide, drug overdose, and alcoholism. And so these kinds of diseases, you see, the time I saw that before was when I was chief economist at the World Bank, at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, when all the social structures fell apart. And again, interestingly, it showed up much more strongly among men, and among that particular cohort as they lost their job, and you saw all the strain that had.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there are big negative consequences from these technological forces. I mean, jobs are not just about incomes, although incomes are a huge part of it. They're about self-perception. They're about standing. They're about having some place to go where you socialize. I mean, in the United States especially, they are the center of people's identities. And unfortunately, nobody is going to save the jobs that created those identities for these kinds of men who did not have some college education in this environment when the jobs that they've traditionally regarded as good jobs for them are just disappearing.
Yeah. So let me just make one more comment, which is I agree completely with Bruce. The thing is that the way it's often perceived is there are very inefficient and costly things that could be done, and when I say costly, they even are things that would destroy more jobs than they save. The example that is being discussed right now is the steel, the action on the steel tariff that Trump is talking about. Ignoring the legality, whether he could actually get whether it's WTO compliant. One of the statistics that people point out, if you restricted imports of foreign steel enough, you would create more jobs in the steel industry in the United States. I mean, that's pretty clear. On the other hand, there are 60 times as many jobs using steel as producing steel. And if you protected the steel industry, it raises the price of steel, making all the guys who export steel-intensive products uncompetitive. So you destroy jobs in the steel-using industry. So he's focused on by focusing on the steel producers, you have a very clear example of something you could do, but you don't see the full effects as they get dispersed throughout the economy.
Well, since I'm probably the only WASP on the panel, I like this Calvinist resurrection of Protestant work ethic, and we'll come back to that. But I want to.
That is a distinctly non-global comment.
But I want to come to what we can do about this in policy. I'm taking from your discussion you don't think building walls around America and protectionism are the right answer. So what is?
Well, can I begin with part of the misconception here? The focus, Trump talked about the trade deficit, and his view is that the trade deficit is because these other countries are not buying our goods because they're engaged in protectionism, and that it's an unfair deal, so we're buying their goods, they're not buying our goods, and that's the reason there's a trade deficit. That's basically the simple and simplistic diagnosis. But I hope you all learned when you were here, is that trade deficits are a macroeconomic phenomena. They are the result of the imbalance between domestic savings and domestic investment. If we, as a country, domestically invest more than we save, it's going to be filled by borrowing from abroad. And the flip side of borrowing from abroad is a trade deficit. So and the mechanism by which the trade deficit gets equilibrated, or gets to be what it has to be, is an adjustment of the exchange rate, the value of the dollar. Almost all secretaries of Treasury, who usually talk about these things, but presidents, eventually learn that there is no little machine in the closet that allows them to set the exchange rate. Usually they come in and they think, the problem where our dollar is too weak or too strong is the guy who was there before hadn't turned the dial right. And now that they're there, they're going to set the dial right, and we'll get a strong dollar. Rubin wanted a strong dollar. And Trump, after a while, he didn't know whether a strong dollar was good or a weak dollar was good. And it was finally explained to him that if you are worried about a trade deficit, you want a weak dollar. So he said, he ordered the market to have a weak dollar. And those of you who trade know that your trades don't really depend on what he tells you. And the value of the dollar, at most, what the President or Secretary of Treasury says has an effect for 3 days, but normally for about 3 seconds. And that was, I think, the case this time. It had zero effect. So what is going on is that if what he has talked about goes through, tax cuts, infrastructure expenditure increases, other expenditure increases, the fiscal deficit will increase, and almost surely that will mean the trade deficit will increase. And so the problem that he's diagnosed will get worse.
But what should we be doing about the factors you and Bruce have identified? If you were to advise President Trump on what the policies of the U.S. should be to deal with these, not in general, but these factors we've been talking about.
Well,
let's simplify this. Forget the global dimension of the problem. Why do I say that? Manufacturing is coming back to the United States from China. China has a very tough road ahead of it. Why? Because the amount of labor involved in manufacturing is going to zero. When General Motors got in trouble in 1980, they had 360,000 workers in North America making cars. These days, they're under 20,000, and they're going to zero. And you see manufacturing coming back with no manufacturing jobs coming back, because it's all because the labor has gone out of it. And as the labor goes out of it, the value of cheap labor disappears, and transportation costs are not falling. So actually, these trends are going to take care of the global problem. I think you've got to focus on the internal dynamic within the United States in this emerging service economy. And what that means is that all the trends that I think Joe and I are concerned with, of income inequality, and in particular specific populations being devastated, are not going away. And you've got to deal with them domestically, and I think you've got to deal with them in the spirit of Chinese hard work. That means we have to have really serious earned income tax credits, so that you can work at a job that is satisfying for you at a wage that may seem low, like $9 an hour for 1,000 hours a year, and we will add to that $9,000, as long as you do that amount of work, another $18,000, which, by the way, we can afford given all the other welfare programs that we have, so you will be able to make a decent living doing that. And I think that's the inevitable adjustment that you're going to have to make, because these trends aren't going away, and the global part of the problem is not what's driving it.
Any thoughts, Joe, on the policy?
I agree that if you're going to be concerned about inequality, which is the underlying problem, inequality manifesting itself in the health statistics that we're talking about, and it's not, when I say inequality, which manifesting itself in the United States is really the problem with the bottom in a very stark way, and not only the bottom, I should say the middle, because it's even median income of a full-time male worker today is at the same level it was 42 years ago. So, and that's full-time, and a lot of the people are not full-time. So things have not gone very well, particularly for males, and that has to do a lot with the restructuring of our economy. So it is a domestic problem, largely, and part of it is income, in the way that Bruce described. Many of the key service sectors are things like health, education, and the value of those services are really socially determined, not market determined. That is to say, the government plays a central role in education and health, and for good reason. And if we decide the value that we associate with the caring of our children, or the caring of our elderly, or the caring of the sick are higher, we devote more money to education, to health, and we pay higher wages. But if we decide we want, the bottom of the barrel to be teaching our children, then we'll pay low wages. So if you paid higher wages to a lot of these jobs, that itself would mean that there would be less inequality, and the middle would be stronger, and there would be more respect for a lot of these jobs.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think one of the things all three of us have written on is the desire to support work in very material ways. The Earned Income Tax Credit in the United States is a practical program, but there are other schemes of wage insurance or direct subsidies for work. An alternative would be these universal basic income, but those don't support work. They fix income, but they don't fix the social issues. And I like it, Joe, that you referred to inequality at the bottom as opposed to a fixation at the top. That is a learning. Thank you. I'm going to take that. Now I want to pivot a little bit. Given all the structural problems you've talked about, where do you see the biggest global risks and opportunities right now? And from a policy perspective, what would you do about it?
I'll let you go first on that one.
Well, I think one of the we are still part of a global economy, and we will be. And I think Trump has thrown a hand grenade.
President Trump.
President Trump, okay, thank you. Has thrown a hand grenade into the global system, and that has effects both on economic relations, but a whole broader set of relations. You're talking about dealing with people in different countries, and part of that is affected by how they view us as Americans, and if they, thankfully they don't blame all of us for what goes on in the administration, but there is a little spillover, and so I think that in some ways I view as a major risk. If you're a business and you're worrying about what happens if you're caught in the middle of a trade war, you're diverted from other things of producing better products or innovation. So I think we're going through a very difficult period of unnecessarily created high levels of uncertainty at the, you might say, at the microeconomic level as well as the macroeconomic level.
Bruce? Yeah, I think actually if you look at the experience since the financial crisis, what you see should be surprising to people. Because what were the two big financial economies in the world? They were the United States and the United Kingdom. If you look at the three big economies that have done the best by far since the crisis, it is the U.S., the U.K., and Germany. And Germany has clearly done it at the expense of other manufacturing economies in Europe. So I actually think the United States, in this context, if we can make the structural adjustments that we have to make in the United States, is in pretty good shape. I think we're better situated to take advantage of services. We have huge surpluses in exporting services as opposed to manufacturers. And it's just going to get tougher and tougher out there to try and make and export manufacturing. On the other hand, we do live in a global world. And one of the things that it's going to take to make that global world sustainable is people outside the United States, but mostly in Africa, are going to have to stop having babies. If we can't control population, there's going to be a world of hurt out there. Now, what has controlled population is development. So we actually care a lot about economic development outside the United States. That has been driven historically by a model of export-led growth. And I think there's a reason for that, which is the big manufacturing institutions and the associated financial institutions that service them create a business community, and that business community creates the effective service operations that are essential going forward. Export-led growth is what creates those manufacturing institutions in relatively poor developing economies. If I'm right, and I think all the evidence is I've been right so far, for those of you who've sat through the globalization class, that in fact exports and globalization is going to get smaller and smaller, that model is going to go away. And that means if you don't get on this train in the next 20 years as a developing economy, you may never develop. And that's a problem that I think on a global level you really want to think about. Because China and Asia may be the last sort of people who succeed in doing this, and we may have a future of high population growth and essentially incurable poverty for as far as the eye can see in the rest of the non-Asian, non-European sort of world. And that's what I think is the biggest challenge today.
Can I just make it even a little bit gloomier, which is...
We have a Malthusian contest here, and then I'm going to change gears.
Yeah. Which is that we're already in a situation where even if all the jobs in manufacturing in China were to go to Africa, which won't happen, it would not create, it would create just a small fraction of the jobs needed for the new entrants into the labor force in Africa as currently occurring. So the challenge in Africa is really, in a demographic sense, is the global challenge. And this challenge of how they're going to make the transition that East Asia made, and is making, is a big question.
Now, of course, I see that Bruce could become president of the World Bank if he could just stop saying stupid foreign money. I could see that this is a career opportunity.
Thank God for that.
I want to, before I open it up to you, so that's your cue to be thinking, a final question for you two. You teach an enormously popular course in the MBA program, Together on Globalization. You teach it in this room. It is always packed. Could you give a sense? How many of you have taken that course? Okay, so we've got some alumni from that course here. Give a quick sense for those who haven't been so fortunate. What are you doing there, and related to the kind of discussion we're having?
Well,
it's actually very similar. I mean, it changes every year. We've been teaching it now for...
But we do disagree all the time. And that is, not on everything, by the way, not on the basic economics, but certainly on the dimensions of policy. And it seems to me that's probably the most valuable part of the experience for the students.
Yeah. Bruce says that I'm an optimist. I come from Gary, Indiana, Midwest, where we are. The other thing about I'm more involved in public policy, and if you're not an optimist, you wouldn't be doing it. you would have left it long ago, and that's why Bruce says he never went into it. But the issues that we deal with have changed, but the underlying theory hasn't. So when we began, we didn't have the euro crisis on our hand.
Oh, no, but we saw it coming.
But we saw it coming, and it came.
I mean, this was predictable going back to 2002 when we first taught the course, that there was going to be this huge problem with manufacturing. There were going to be huge problems with global imbalances. They were going to be exacerbated by the euro because they couldn't adjust the exchange rate. And they were going to create huge financial dislocations.
Where's the next crisis, then, before I open up? What do you think? Next crisis.
I think you're in it. I think that this level of growth and this level of growing inequality and the consequence, I mean, look, a period in human history since 1820 when managers like you actually started to have a huge impact on human standards of living, in which life expectancy falls in developed economies, is an extraordinary phenomenon. And to ignore that as a crisis is to really ignore what's really going on. And I think that's going to continue and get worse if we don't do these structural corrections to wages and other opportunities.
Okay, floor is open to all of you to ask our panelists a question. Bob, do we have microphones? Or okay.
Do the politicians know what you're saying?
Some. and there's another element. Some of them may know and feel constrained, that they feel that they can't explain it. I think politics is complicated, and of course, so yes, the answer is I think some of them do know it, but the question is, can they persuade others of it?
I think the number who know it is that small, and I'll say why. In public discourse...
You talk to different people than I do, though.
That is fair. In the public discourse, it is all about human agency. It's all about good guys and bad guys, and politicians, frankly, to put up with other politicians, have to believe that. So it's all about self-definition. I'm a good guy, they're bad guys. And I've got to do something to stop the bad guys. Certainly that's the discourse around the financial dimension of the crisis. But the reality is here, there's no bad guys. It is forces of productivity growth that are driving this. And that is a very unappealing story for people who have gone into public service at substantial human cost to do good. And I think that's the biggest problem here. I think people are not interested in sort of disembodied structural solutions. They want to slay their enemies. And here, let me make the thing about Trump. In the global scheme of things, if in his 4 years, Trump manages to successfully order a chicken salad sandwich from the White House mess, I will be impressed.
I would add to that, the chicken salad's actually not that good in the White House mess. I would add to that, Bob, that the problem is on the left, people have long just felt like the right answer is to put anyone hurting on the dole. On the right, people don't want to talk about it. And so you have this problem where supporting work, the kinds of things we're talking about, it is expensive. It would require conservatives moving off their dime and liberals moving off their dime, and they're not ready to do it yet. Will they someday? I hope so, but they're not ready now. Other questions? Yes?
If I may just articulate, there's a think tank that put out a paper that talks about that the problem is beyond just globalization, but it is the permanent search by capital of cheaper sources of labor. You can call it productivity. So slavery, end of slavery, deflation of wages in the industrial north, colonization in its sort of indentured labor deployed in agriculture throughout the world by the British and other colonial powers, that it has always been the primacy of capital over labor is where we are today. We can call it productivity growth and automation, but it is still a search for cheaper or as you said, zero labor, right? So if you were an inefficient user of capital, such as the Chinese-supported steel mills that create labor at the expense of inefficient use of capital, is that really one way to support jobs while we transition from, to the utopian future?
All right, so first, the narrative that you've just produced has literally nothing to do with human history. What you have to understand...
It's too subtle. You're going to have to reframe it for me.
If you look at human history, from Roman times when we have the first good data on standards of living until roughly 1800 to 1820, when the Industrial Revolution and capital starts to play a big part in human activity, there is no net improvement in human standards of living. The vast majority of the human race for that whole period is essentially expensive livestock. They eat only staples, they live with their animals, and on and on. Starting in 1820, human life is transformed by productivity growth. And in practice, the jobs have occurred. So literally, the people who've suffered and continue to suffer today are the people who are outside that system of capital. It's the people in Africa. It's the people in parts of Latin America. So I think thinking that there is some sort of systematic problem here with market economies and capitalist systems is just wrong. I think there are very special problems that we confronted in the Depression with the death of agriculture, that we actually solved by the Second World War, moving everybody off the farms at government expense, that we're confronting now with this transition to services. And I think they're solvable in a market context, no matter what capital does. I think if you valorize and subsidize jobs that people want to do of the sort that Joe talked about, you're going to have plenty of jobs here. You're going to have people living actually acceptable lives in the face of the downward pressure on low-income wages and the increase in inequality. So I wouldn't despair at that structural level. I think we're in a transition, and frankly, being a professional athlete, even a golf or tennis pro that doesn't pay that much, but with a decent earned income tax credit would enable you to have a decent life, is a pretty good job. Thanks to capital for that.
Is the earned income tax credit a form of subsidy in a market economy?
Yes. I mean, look, market economies are not perfect. That, therefore, you can run them without any intervention is not what I think anybody on this panel is arguing about. But don't underestimate the value of those market economies for the fact that everybody in the developed world today lives as well as they do. And you can see it, by the way. Just go to North Korea.
So before we have a tour guide to Pyongyang, let's... Yes, ma'am.
I was interested to hear what you said about population control, and you specifically said about Africa, but are there parts of the world where population control would be a detriment?
When I was young, there were, and this is how old I am. No, you're a little older than me, Joe, right? He's a child.
Much younger.
Right. When I was young, there were 2.5 billion people in the world. And that seemed a pretty good number. Today, there are, 8 billion going up? So I think almost anywhere, population decline is not such a bad thing, provided, as I say, you provide support for the kind of jobs that will take care of the old people, which will mean, by the way, fewer young people in schools, so the dependency ratios actually don't go up that much.
So the one country where, for instance, a large country where there's a discussion of this issue is Japan, and where the workforce is in decline already. And to me, the issue is not the GDP number, what's happening in GDP. It's the quality of life. And what you care about is GDP per capita, and that doesn't really incorporate the feeling of congestion and lots of other things. And I have not seen any good argument that having a moderate depopulation of Japan would be a bad thing. I think there are some countries where the problem is rather different, where there's no economic opportunities and all the young people leave, and then you get an unbalanced exodus from the country. But the problem there is not the overall level of population. It's the fact that the young people who've been who have talent, who are able to work, have left the country because there are no opportunities.
Question over here on this side, because I'm looking over here. Sir.
You mentioned Africa, which may be the last continent that's open, in my opinion. But what do you foresee in Africa, with all its mineral resources and its workers, for opportunities for American technology and know-how, since it has all the natural resources?
Again, natural resources in modern developed economies are not what it's about.
Well, could you focus on the 200,000 African millionaires that have recently been identified?
Sure. I mean, great. Fantastic. But how many people are in Africa?
1.8 billion.
1.8 billion. So 200,000 is not a lot of that.
That's macro, but a micro is an identified market opportunity with those 250,000 African millionaires.
I mean, there may be market opportunities here, but this is, and I really want to get, it's probably a good idea to refer back to the very important point about population. Africa is basically the only continent or only part of the world where fertility rates are still substantially above replacement. And it's pretty crowded. And that is what I think the issue is. And I think to get those fertility rates down, the evidence is there has to be broad-based development. And I don't think that, you know, as encouraging it as it is to have those 100,000 millionaires, that's going to solve the problem of development in Africa.
I mean, going back to the population, the density of population in Africa has converted the continent from a land abundant, where they could use slash and burn, very inefficient land use, to a continent where there's real land scarcity. And that itself is a major structural transformation of how you organize land markets. And the natural resources, to go back to the theme, don't create jobs. The natural resources, if the value of those resources are appropriated within the country, can be used to create development. But if they're stolen out of the country, then that's not the case. And the concern is that in recent years, there's been, or they're appropriated by a small number of people who keep their money outside the country. And the concern is that, you know, literally hundreds of billions of dollars bleed out of Africa every year, more than the amount of money that's coming in. And the question is how to stop that.
Other questions? Right here in the front. Yeah.
With a wealth transfer mechanism that I presume we agree an earned income tax credit is, and a growing population of people receiving those credits, and as a percentage of the population, a decreasing percentage of people who can supply the money for those credits, how is that sustainable? And will it not structurally increase the amount of inequality, because you'll need more people at the upper end making more money to distribute to people at the lower end?
I mean, if you look at what governments collect now, that go into a huge variety of overlapping and unfocused programs, you don't have to increase government spending, especially in Europe and similar places, by that much to have a seriously meaningful earned income tax credit. I mean, that, I think, the idea that we don't collect enough taxes to do this by a wide margin, I think is just false. The second thing is that these trends in inequality don't seem to be because people say, oh, I want an after-tax income of X, and therefore I'm somehow going to raise my pre-tax income if you raise my tax rate. Because, you know, when I was, again, I keep coming back to when I was a kid in the spirit of this reunion, marginal tax rates in the United States were 91%. And they have come down steadily by a lot, so that for most of the...
But you're not working harder. How did that work? I thought you were supposed to be...
That's my point exactly.
Other questions? I'll take one from way over here in the back there.
You've talked about all different kinds of aspects, but one of the things that you haven't mentioned is education. It sort of surprises me.
Okay, education in all of this. Joe, Bruce.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, education is absolutely critical. And if you look, again, one of the major sources of inequality is inequality, you might say, in endowments of quality education. So, and there are, you know, analyses of why that is the case, the fact that we have a local based education system, and over the last 35 years, we've had more economic segregation, so that people who are poor are more likely to live in a poor school district and therefore get a poor education. So yes, I mean, I think it's, you know, it is an important part. The notion that just, you know, giving a little bit better education is the panacea, I think, is wrong. There one more thing about education, two more things about education I think are important. One is, I think there's a growing recognition that preschool education is very important, and particularly for those at the bottom. The evidence is, as I said, pretty overwhelming, and we have not invested very much in preschool education. The other one is the United States system of financing tertiary university education is different, and student loans now are $1.2 trillion and are increasingly viewed as an impediment for access to education. And then just maybe one final point that highlights the point that you made. You know, at Columbia and other selective universities, we have needs-blind admission. So we pride ourselves in accepting students on the basis of their how well they do in exams, and yet we have I don't know about numbers for Columbia, but in general for the selective schools, most of them are similar. Only about 8 or 9% of the student body comes from the lower half of the population in terms of income, and that's because they haven't gotten the kind of education that would enable them to do well on those exams that would qualify them for Columbia or one of the other selective schools.
Okay, I got a very different take on education. I'm going to do this really quickly.
Go for it.
Education is the most badly discussed issue. There are two educational systems in every society. One of them is very general. It isolates people. It teaches them subjects with no immediate relevance to what they're going to do, with no meaningful rewards that are immediate for success or failure. The second system embeds people in purposeful activity. It focuses them on learning very particular things that they actually have to know to perform economically useful functions, and there are very meaningful rewards and punishments for not doing well. One of those systems is called school, and the other is called on-the-job training. Overwhelmingly, the most important system, surprise, surprise, is the second one. And that's the one that you want to have work well, and that's why jobs and the nature of jobs And actually the institutional structure of work that supports on-the-job training is so important. So actually, we've been talking about education here by default. The evidence on school, and this is something I actually learned from Joe when he was at the World Bank, is that the purpose of school is to do three things. One is it's to teach people to be norm obedient. And the societies that do that well, and here I come back to Glenn's Scandinavian
Mr. Norm.
typically have very, quote, successful school systems. Although they don't do all that much better when you look at productivity after on-the-job experience. The second thing you have to teach people to do increasingly, and here there's a big problem because women are much better at this than men, is navigate complex social interactions. And as a result of that, 60% of college graduates in the United States are women. And that's going to be hard to correct if the population that's in trouble is men. The third thing you need out of school is a good 8th grade education. The development literature indicates that when people have that, they can succeed in the on-the-job training system. So I think the critical thing is to develop a system of consistent access to that second educational system and focus the first system on those three things that are really important.
Can I just make one more
Of course.
that highlights an aspect of economic policy that we haven't talked about, which is good macroeconomic policy, keeping the unemployment rate very low. And the reason for that, in part, is that only when you have the unemployment rate very low do you bring into the labor force a lot of the groups that are marginalized. So if on-the-job training is important, the only way you're going to get that on-the-job training is if they're working. And unfortunately, if you run an economy where there's a high level of unemployment, those people at the bottom not only begin at the bottom, they then don't get the on-the-job training, and they fall further behind.
Okay, right here.
Just wanted to throw another topic in the mix, energy and environment. I mean, nothing short of a revolution in the United States with oil and gas hydraulic fracturing. And also, you know, climate change. You could argue that sort of the countries that are the least able to cope with it are maybe the hardest hit. Just want to know where energy environment hits in your mix there.
Gentlemen?
You talk about this in the course, so you go ahead.
Yeah. So I think you know, climate change, as you said, is very serious, and it is affecting the developing countries, Africa, certain parts of India. Much worse. I mean, Canada, the joke is, actually benefits from getting a little warmer climate. Newfoundland might actually, instead of that picture of the iceberg, you could have a beach in Newfoundland. I don't know, and there are broader consequences. I mean, there's a strong view that disease burdens will be increasing because the kinds of insects that are, you know, viruses that survive will be different, and at least in a transition period will be, and we will be in a transition period for a very long time, will be different. And so there are very serious consequences. Also, climate change has increased weather variability, and that means you're going to have more natural disasters, and the cost of that is going to go way up. Climate change is a quintessential global problem, so you need global cooperation. You know, the molecules don't carry passports. So if we produce a molecule over the United States, or China does, it doesn't know it's supposed to stay right above China. It mixes with everybody else. And so there has to be really global cooperation. And that's why I think a lot of us are very concerned about the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Agreement. It didn't achieve the objective of getting all the way down to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees centigrade, but it created a momentum where a very large number of firms, maybe a large fraction of firms, have actually been changing their technology, thinking about this is the way they have to think about technology in the future. The scarce resource is no longer labor, as Bruce has pointed out. The scarce resource is our planet, and we don't price our planet or the scarcity of atmospheric scarcity or water for that matter. And therefore, there's a very big movement now going on, and trying to. If you believe in the price system, you ought to think about pricing carbon. And as I say, I was just down at World Bank and IMF meetings the last 3 days, and there are a lot of discussions now about how to do that.
Okay, let me look up right here. Then I'll probably take one more question.
I was wondering if the panel could give me an idea for the next 5 years, the technological changes that will bring to the world in comparison to the last 20 years, and how will that affect the world? The rate of change.
The rate of technological change is slowing. If you go back 31 years from today, we would be in 1986. Most of the big companies that underlie the personal computer and ultimately, therefore, the Internet revolution were in place. Microsoft, Oracle, Adobe,
Facebook,
Intel.
Google.
No, that's 2. I got 4.
Okay.
Keep going.
Keep going.
They're in place, and they've been in place for 31 years. The reason I think that 31-year comparison is important is that and I've said this before, in 1914, the world went to war on horses. In 1945, which is 31 years later, they dropped the atom bomb. That is rapid technological change. And by the way, that is mirrored in the rate of productivity growth, which in those periods was about 3%, 3.5%, and since then has fallen to about 1.5% a year. So I think a lot of this discussion, partly because the media and media industries have been so importantly impacted by recent technological change. But if you think about housing, you think about food, you think about things like that, which were the predominant products of human economic activity, those changes took place a long time ago, and they're not changing so rapidly anymore.
So let me just say, there is an active debate in the economics profession. The first thing you're sure is we can't predict because we don't know what innovations are going to occur 30 years from now because we don't know what they are. That's the nature of innovation. Bob Gordon has written an influential book where he basically sides very strongly with Bruce, and I think it's probably right. He says, look, at innovations like electricity or the toilet are much more important than Facebook. That one affect, these affect your life expectancy, and just
the market value of Facebook's higher than Toto.
Well. Yeah.
The diamond water paradox.
So.
I don't even use Facebook, so I'm the worst to ask this. But anyway.
So Joel Mokyr, also at Northwestern.
And this is the better side of the debate, but yes.
Well,
go ahead.
but I actually says that there are actually a lot of dynamic things going on, and that we may not be capturing in our GDP statistics all of what is going on. The value of connectedness, we talk about the value of work, that's not captured, but also there are other things that are not well captured in our GDP statistics, and it is observable that a lot of young people like to be connected. I don't understand this. I like sitting there writing and being disconnected, but I look around and I see even while I'm lecturing, that they are that they seem to be enjoying being connected more than listening to me. So, but I think that they may not be learning as much from this. So anyway, it is an active debate. I don't know.
Okay, I'm going to take one more question in the back, right there.
Thanks. I wanted to ask that maybe the rate of technological change is not so much an issue as the paradigm shift in the negligible marginal cost for providing an extra service nowadays compared to the past. Bruce, you were saying that the service industry is becoming the bigger part of the economy, and to sell an extra song or an extra movie or rant in Facebook, it's just a copy of a program, and you're making money off of it. Doesn't that have an effect as opposed to the rate of technological change?
It does, and I'm not going to argue that, but you have to understand what the big services are. The biggest service by far is housing, and the incremental cost of housing has not been reduced by the internet. The second biggest service by far is medical care, and medical care still involves, and I think will involve for the foreseeable future, a lot of human intervention simply because that's what human beings like to see. The third biggest service is education. And you guys are all sitting in this room. Now, maybe Joe's students are learning something from being on the computer. But by the way, the theory of education is that it does take a human interaction to have it work really well. Then there's personal services, and then there's financial services. So the sort of things that you're talking about are pretty far down the service food chain. So I think they are, those effects are there, but in the broad scheme of what, and especially if you want to see what people are going to spend money on in the future, look at rich families. I mean, you have to understand that even though incomes have not risen that far, that human consumption has changed a lot.
So there are a couple very prominent sectors, for particularly high tech, for which what you say is true, and more broadly, innovation has that characteristic. Once you discover something, the value, the value using the cost of using that knowledge is zero. You can replicate. So if we discover a new drug, the cost of the drug is relatively small. So there are parts of our economy for which that is very important, what you do. And that part is governed by very different rules than the standard manufacturing with diminishing returns. And those sectors are likely to be highly non-competitive. And because they're non-competitive, they are contributing to inequality. And you see that in Silicon Valley very strongly. And so what is very clear is that Silicon Valley gets a lot of attention. One way of thinking, when you think about the capitalization of Facebook, and it's so large, you shouldn't think of that necessarily as all a new value added. What they've done is they've captured the capitalization of conventional publishers, which have gone down to zero. So they're doing, so as they've gained, others have lost. And so it's not all of what they've done has been on the basis of increasing the value, their valuation, the capitalization is not just the increase of the value that they've added to our economy. Some of what they've done is because of their role relative to other industries that they've had some adverse effects.
But these are all, they are growing sectors, admittedly, that Joe has described and you've described. And that's important, but they're not big in the overall scheme of the economy.
Yeah,
I think they won't be for a long time.
I think you can see why ideas and impact are in our wheelhouse. Join me in thanking Bruce Greenwald, Joe Stiglitz.